Welcome to a new country. In this mega episode of analysis, we are going to cover all your questions and make sure you are equipped to understand this new politics and this new political landscape that we're going into. From coalition options to the threats and opportunities facing every party, to policy considerations, to provinces, and to the presidency and the cabinet. We have you covered. This is an election episode that you don't want to miss. I'm going to break down what this election means right now as it stands. Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX. And if you're new around here, this is South Africa's #1 place to analyze and explore South African politics. We do that through interviews and analysis. Firstly, thank you so much for taking us past 100,000 views. The numbers have been crazy on this channel. We did 1 million views last week. Subscribers are way past 100,000. This channel is becoming a major fixture in South Africa. And we're independent, we're digital, we're youth focused, and we welcome you as part of the SMWX family, an increasingly influential family. Right, you are in the right place. Get a cup of tea, sit back, relax. We are going to analyze all that has happened in our country with this election. And by the end of this episode, I think you'll be really well equipped to understand many of the dynamics that are happening here. Wow, what an election, what a set of results. And the pace doesn't let up because now we go into a massive moment for our country of coalition negotiations, coalition dynamics, and all that comes with it. So here's what I'm going to do in this episode. First, I'm going to look at the election result and coalition dynamics, because a number of pictures are presenting themselves, and I think a lot of people have missed many of the dynamics that are going on in coalition. So first, we're going to look at all these different dynamics and chew over them. Once we've looked at coalitions, I want to look politically at what are the threats and what are the opportunities for the 4 biggest parties in South Africa: ANC-DA, MK, EFF. Then, once we've looked at coalitions and the political situation for the parties, I want to look at who will be president and what will the cabinet, the national cabinet, look like, because that's a key consideration. And I also then, after that, want to look at policy, because policy has actually gone missing in a lot of the analysis of this election. We're looking at this purely politically, and sure, the political intrigue is high. But the question is, what policies will the new national government adopt, and what will that mean for the future of South Africa? And that's ultimately the key question, because what the government chooses to do is what this election was all about. So it's going to be a feast of analysis, because we have a feast of things going on in our country. Sit back and let's get into some of the coalition dynamics right now. So starting off, we know where we stand with an ANC at 40%, DA at 21 or so, MK at 14, EFF at 9.5. So what does this mean? Well, first, I want to look at the obvious coalition options, and then I want to talk you through some of the less obvious options, but options which I think need to be considered as we deepen our analysis of coalitions. So the first option that seems to have emerged and is being touted, especially by those people who brought us the new dawn. If you look at those people in media, civil society, and politics who gave us the new dawn narrative, exactly the same forces are giving us the ANC-DA narrative. And there's this idea that the ANC and the DA will come together to form a grand coalition, something I explored on this channel more than a year ago. So the ANC-DA coalition is one big option. Now, there are 2 variations of this option. The first is that the ANC and DA go into just a formal coalition where the DA takes some parts of cabinet, the ANC retains other parts of cabinet, and they co-govern with the ANC as the dominant partner and the DA as the minor partner. Now, the second option is that the ANC becomes what's called a minority government, and it relies on the DA for support in parliament, but the DA does not actually form part of the government. And what could happen in that scenario as well is that the DA could take over control of parliament, so it could take over key committee chairpersonships and the Speaker of Parliament, and then the ANC would control the executive. So you would have a kind of split between executive governance and legislative governance. So the interesting thing about this is that I think people need to just hold their horses on this as the absolute ultimate perfect solution for South Africa. By the way, there are no perfect solutions, and believe me, I'm going to go into the challenges facing all coalition options, but I just want people to bridle their fervor for a minute about this ANC-DA coalition. And the reason is, firstly, just the people who predicted that the new dawn would be this utopia for South Africa were completely wrong, and I don't trust their political judgment one iota. And so when I look at them talking about how the DA-ANC coalition will create this economic heaven and governance perfection, I'm a little worried about that. Yes, in the short term, there'll probably be some kind of rally in financial markets, and there will be euphoria in capital, and big business will probably be friendly to this coalition, and that could result in, if not economic growth, not a short-term market run. However, exactly the same thing happened when Cyril Ramaphosa became president. There was great joy in capital. There was great joy in the elite circles of South African society. And in the short term, everyone was happy. But in the long term, cracks very soon began to show. And I'm not sure that people who are celebrating this ANC-DA coalition are fully appreciative of just how complex such an enterprise would be. So questions you would need to ask yourself on this coalition, and like I say, I'm going to get to all the options later because no option is perfect, but what happens to key policy questions? Because the DA will extract certain policy questions. What would the blowback be for the ANC in making those extractions? Do they sacrifice BEE and affirmative action and questions of racial justice? Do they sacrifice foreign policy? Do they sacrifice labor market reforms? Do they sacrifice a basic income grant system where they were moving towards universal basic income, but that will be constrained? Do they sacrifice spending on various services? What are the policy sacrifices that the ANC will have to make that will be unpopular to the wider society and the wider electorate? So there's that. Then there's what the EFF and the MK party will do with such a coalition. And what I would say to you is that the two best political strategists, leave aside whether you like them or not, the two best political strategists in South African politics are Julius Malema and Jacob Zuma. So when you form an ANC-DA government, you are giving a political gift to the two best strategists in South African politics. And you have to consider what they would do with that and what hay they would make with that coalition. And they will be able to make a lot of hay with that kind of coalition. They'll talk about how the ANC has abandoned its liberation principles. They'll talk about how we have a minority-led economy, and now we're also going to have a minority-led government. They'll talk about how the DA's interests are in the interests of a white minority, and that the ANC has sold out to that white minority, and therefore the government itself is a neo-colonial government. They will bring out cracks in that government with corruption. They will put the DA under test and say, will you support President Ramaphosa on Phala? They will stand up in Parliament the day that Parliament opens and say, we want a new investigation into corruption. Will the DA support President Ramaphosa and suppress that investigation? Or will they let it happen, in which case the president is going to be under big pressure and the DA will have to make a choice? So they will force the DA to make difficult choices immediately, let alone what can happen in different provinces. So the other consideration is that don't confuse political stability with social stability. When the ANC and DA come together, if they do, there will be social backlash. And don't underestimate the way that many, particularly Black South Africans, and many ANC members and supporters will be deeply offended by the idea of an ANC-DA coalition. And what we have seen so far for the last 30 years is that many very popular policies like affirmative action and BEE, have not had to come into the public domain so much because the government supports them. But if you take that away from people, or if you take away labor market, or you take away the minimum wage from people, just you wait to see exactly how popular those policies are, and the government could have a serious civil society backlash outside of politics against that. On the other hand, the ANC-DA coalition would be politically stable to the extent that the parliamentary majority would be unassailable. They would have, nearly, what is it? The ANC is at 40 and the DA, so 60% of seats. And they would be able to govern and be able to take decisions and see those decisions through parliament very, very easily. There are those who believe that an ANC-DA coalition would be good for governance, citing the Western Cape and governance conditions in the Western Cape, and the way that the DA might be able to turn around certain institutions, that water, that electricity, that the basics would be capable of being delivered. However, I'm also a little skeptical about what we mean by even political and economic stability, because things that are good for the middle class do not equate to stability. And we have not had stability when you consider inequality, when you consider poverty, when you consider spatial injustice, when you consider unemployment. So quite apart from what the markets think and what global financial markets might do and what would happen to millionaires and billionaires' portfolios, we also need to consider to what extent will an ANC-DA coalition actually be able to get to the root of South Africa's economic malaise. And that root is a Black majority that predominantly lives in townships, informal settlements, and rural areas, that is unemployed, that is in poverty, and in situations that are the byproducts of our apartheid past. To what extent would an ANC-DA government actually be able to get to that root? Yes, we may have superficial stability, and the rand may be in a nice position for speculators. But we must always remember in this country that that is not the marker for economic stability. The true marker for economic stability is lifting millions of people out of poverty, lifting millions of people out of unemployment, lifting millions of people out of conditions of spatialized racial injustice. And even when we look at the Western Cape, we see that the DA, yes, has managed to get the inner city working, has managed to get infrastructure working better than in other places, but they have not really been able to make a dent on the structural inequalities that exist in our society. And so I would see those persisting under an ANC-DA government. So there's that possibility and there's that prospect. I'll get deeper into it as I go into some of the other dimensions I'm going to talk about today. But let's come on to another option. And that other option, of course, would be the ANC-MK. Now, what plus maybe EFF or some other party. Now, what we have seen after this election, I think has given me some cause for concern, and that is MK raising doubts about the credibility of the election and making certain veiled threats about the decision to announce the results of the election. And so the MK party will have really, I think, alienated some in the ANC by taking these steps. To be honest, what I would have done were I in MK and if I was a strategist. And today you'll see that I'm not a member of any political party, and I'm trying to give you the view from lots of different perspectives. If I were an MK strategist, I would be going on a victory lap around the country right now. I wouldn't be bogging myself down in these electoral disputes that are quite unpopular. MK must remember that it only has 14% of the vote. That means many other South Africans didn't vote for MK, right? 85%. So I would be going on a victory lap around the country. I'd be holding thank you rallies. I would be demonstrating my support, and I would be just taking in that I was the best performing party in this election. Now it seems like MK is kind of diverting that focus and going down this rabbit hole of an electoral challenge. And I must say, even though there are some people who believe really firmly in um, electoral inaccuracies, the majority of South Africans just want this election behind us. The majority of South Africans think these elections were free and fair and credible. And there are major things that need to be happening in this country now. We actually need to get on with the business of governing and the business of changing people's lives, which is what MK campaigned on, changing the fortunes of the black majority. And in some ways, I think this decision to call into question the electoral results will make people who are maybe willing to consider, okay, what could the MK look like, a bit more cautious, because they're worried, is the agenda to create instability? And I don't think people want that kind of instability in their lives after a very unstable and uncertain election. So there's that. But at the end of the day, having said that, and maybe criticize the direction MK has taken after these results, think of this. The ANC, MK, and EFF were one party going into the 2009 election, right? And all of those forces that are currently there were already in the ANC. Now, between 2009 and 2014, the sky didn't fall. The economy didn't tank. In fact, there was moderate economic growth in some of those years. Now, from 2014, when things started fracturing and splitting, that's when we saw the worst times in South Africa. And I think over the last 10 years, we've really seen bad times. Not to say that 2009 to 2014 was good. I was a vocal critic of that period. And we saw some dramatic corruption, and we saw silly economic decisions taken. We actually saw a very moderate economic policy, if you ask me, when those forces were actually governing and had influence altogether under the roof of the ANC. So what I will say is that I think South Africans who are hysterical about the prospect of an MK ANC or ANC EFF coalition need to just calm down a bit. If that does happen, believe me, it won't necessarily always be pretty, that's for sure. But I just disagree with this idea that South Africa will slide into, that's the DA's narrative. And I don't agree with the DA's narrative that doomsday will soon approach. Doomsday for South Africa is a long way away, because this country has resilient institutions and it has wise people, maybe if not wise politicians. And I wouldn't predict this country's decline anytime soon, no matter what happens. So you've got that. And so you will have people within the ANC who will want a potential MK or EFF or both alliance, because they know the people in MK. It'll be better the devil they know. And ideologically, if you just put all the noise aside, in theory, the EFF and MK are more ideologically aligned to the ANC than the DA. They come from the same liberation heritage. They're pursuing the same kind of economic transformation goals. I'm not saying that these parties actually hold those views genuinely. I'm just saying, in theory, in terms of the political positioning of these parties, when you strip away the noise, they're ideologically aligned. However, we have no idea how MK will govern. And I think that's a big question of uncertainty. We have no idea how the EFF would govern nationally. And so a potential weakness of those coalitions and what could cause anxiety in people, not just people who are right-wing, radical crazies, is how stable will that government be? And will that government be able to prove that it's actually about changing the lives of people in South Africa? So once again, I'm not so convinced yet that even an EFF-MK government, ANC government, which purports to really put the lot of the black majority at its center, I'm not convinced yet that it would be able to deliver that. We're talking about massive changes, wise changes that need to happen, that put those who have been left out for the last 30 years at the center. So actually, if you look at it, no matter whether it's EFF, MK, or DA, ANC, it's going to be very difficult for any government to truly strike at the structural challenges. And I don't mean structural economic reforms like privatization and all of that. I mean structural economic reforms that actually get to the heart of South Africa's economic and social crises. It's going to be very difficult for any government to actually do that. And right now, I am taking a look and see approach. Remember, you don't have to support any coalition. Like, you don't have to make a choice, right? And I think the fact of the matter is that either any one of these obvious coalitions is going to have its merits and its demerits, but you don't have to go in hook, line, and sinker for any of them. In fact, what I think the appropriate thing to do as a citizen is to make sure that you hold any one of these coalition arrangements accountable. And that's certainly going to be the approach that I adopt. That if they do good things, we will praise them for doing good things. And if they turn around and start doing weird things, we will criticize them for doing weird things. Don't fall into the trap of feeling like you have to support one or other coalition, because you may be embarrassed, just like those who supported the New Dawn and told us it was going to be perfect have been embarrassed before. So you've got those two options. Now, I want to complicate the analysis further by now looking at some other options, because people have tended to look at what could happen at the national government level. Oh, by the way, the ANC can actually form a government without MK, EFF, or DA, but it would be a really unstable government. It would require IFP, PA, and a whole lot of small parties. And it's always dangerous to put small parties together in a coalition, because then the small parties get leverage over the bigger party. And what you could then have is one party with one seat that's in government dictating the direction of the country. And so the ANC is unlikely to go for that option. But I just want to let you know that there actually also is an option where the ANC goes with neither the DA, the EFF, nor the MK. Okay, cool. So as I was saying, we're going to complicate the analysis a bit further. What you actually need to look at in terms of these coalition arrangements is not just the national picture, but you actually need to look at the national, the provincial, and even the local government picture. And so there could be various different arrangements in national, provincial, and local government that could affect these coalition agreements. So let's have a look at that, right? So what we know is that Gauteng is kind of similar to the national picture, with the ANC having a much diminished majority, but it's still the biggest party. And then you've got DA, EFF, MK that'll have a say. Then you've got KZN, where the MK is the biggest party, and it looks like that could be an interesting one, because MK, EFF, NFP gets you to exactly half the seats, and ANC-DA, IFP also gets you to exactly half the seats. So we may have some kind of stalemate there in one scenario. But effectively, what we've got here is we've got national government and two big provinces that are actually part of this equation. So I actually think this is an opportunity for compromise, and it could be an opportunity to stabilize the situation, because what you can do is you can have one form of coalition nationally, but you can make concessions to the other party that maybe loses out in a national coalition provincially, in which case you kind of have a government of national unity, but it's not the traditional government of national unity. It's divided between national and provincial. So let me make a concrete example. For example, the ANC could say, okay, we're going with the DA nationally, but we're going to sacrifice KZN provincially. So MK, you're going to get KZN. You might be disappointed that you're not part of a national coalition, but you're going to get KZN, and let's see what you can do. And by the way, then the onus will be on MK to actually govern in KZN and actually deliver to the people. And then we will have to see exactly how well it governs, right? Because now we're out of elections. Now we're at the point where people must back up their promises with actual action. They must actually change people's lives, right? So that's one option, is that you could have a national coalition which makes a concession provincially. So that's one option. Another option, for example, is that the ANC says, okay, we're going with the EFF and say the IFP nationally, but we give Gauteng to the DA. So again, you see how you kind of balance out what's happening there by making all parties feel like they got something. And in some ways, that may preserve a certain amount of stability in the country in the same way that a traditional national unity government governs. So you can see that the provincial dynamics are actually bearing also on the national dynamics, and there are ways of carving up the or cutting the cake, which could balance things out and satisfy different parties and different constituencies. So there's a kind of national unity government approach that could, in one scenario, be a split between national and provincial government. And I think that might actually be an interesting way to balance things here, because we do have to think about stability, right? And we do have to think about making sure that even big, sizable minorities don't have the incentive to spoil the whole thing, right? Because they can. And so what we really need is leadership from all the parties at this point, right? All these political parties told us that they had the capacity to lead. They told us that their leaders were the right people to govern this country. And now, as this election ends, they need to lead in real life. The country is uncertain. The country doesn't know which way things are going, and we're all worried about worst case scenarios. So what does leadership mean? It means that those people who are telling us for the last year that they are all these great leaders, they need to find the wisdom and the foresight to come up with a scenario that is good, not just for the people who voted for them, but for the entire country. Some combination of economic stability and growth and redistribution that is good not just for the markets and for millionaires and billionaires, but is also good for the people who have been left out of the spoils of democracy for 30 years. Some combination which includes political stability so that we don't have a new government every week. Some combination which also takes into account social stability so that we don't have uprisings against unpopular government decisions. Some combination that maybe will result in giving something to each of the key players in a way that they can contribute to a deeper national agenda. And every leader, from President Cyril Ramaphosa right now, down to John Steenhuisen, to Julius Malema, to Jacob Zuma, and it's a pity we don't have more women political leaders, by the way, as I rattle off the names. Every political leader right now needs to show us that they're a leader, that they can fashion some outcome that is not just about a cynical power game, but is actually about the lot of South Africans. And I believe that those options are there, but they need to seize those options and make them work. So those are some of the ideas. There are other forms of unity government that I also just want to consider, right? So what you could also do in a national unity government is you could do something like this. So you would say, we're going to split the executive according to some parties, and then we're going to split the legislature, the national legislature, parliament, according to other parties. And then again, you have a sense in which everybody has got something, but you also have a sense in which the group of parties in parliament that exist there can actually hold the executive accountable. So parliament doesn't just become a rubber stamping institution. So what would this look like? Let's say you have ANC-DA and multi-party charter people in cabinet and the executive. And then you have EFF, MK, maybe UDM, ATM in parliament. And then what you really then say then is, look, we're going to govern, but you on the other side are going to hold us accountable. What you also do is then you would throw down the gauntlet to the EFF and you would say, okay, you've been loud and boisterous in this parliament, trying to hold us to account. You take it over and show us how accountability works. And then the EFF would have the onus of making sure that Parliament works, and they would have to do that. Otherwise, they'd be punished. The reverse could also apply. You could have an ANC, EFF, IFP, for example, executive, and then you could have a multi-party charter legislature. So, and this could also apply provincially, etc. So there are lots of different options. Now, what I want to do, which we'll look at this from yet another angle, is I want to look at this from the perspective of the political parties themselves, and what are the threats and what are the opportunities that present to each of the four biggest political parties. Thanks for watching SMWX. Before we get back to the episode, I just wanted to let you know the 4 ways that you can help support this channel if you want to see us growing bigger and better to keep you more entertained and informed. The first way is you can invite me to speak at your company, your school, your institution. You'll see the contact details down below. The second way is that you can become a member of this channel. Become a member, or you can give us a thanks. You'll see there's like a heart with a $sign in the ribbon below this video. Buy me and the team some coffee for this episode. The third way you can get involved is you can advertise on the channel. Now, I'd much rather the community of viewers would be advertisers on this channel than me going out to people who don't really know about SMWX and trying to explain it to them. So if you're a viewer and you have a business and you want to partner and you love this platform, let's partner on this channel. And then finally, you can buy merchandise, you can buy books. All this is in the description down below. Now let's get back to the episode. So let's start with the ANC, and I think this is one of the most important parts of this video, right? The threats and the opportunities to parties. Here, let's start with the threats to the ANC. One of the major threats that I foresee confronting the ANC is internal division and instability, no matter what they do, right? And remember, we are treating the ANC in these coalition conversations often as if it's one thing that has one mind. But we know that the ANC is a complex party that is often divided, right? So if the ANC goes with the DA, there is definitely going to be a portion of ANC voters, ANC members, and indeed ANC leaders that disagree fundamentally with that decision. And the question for the ANC then internally will be, is the decision to go with the DA and the political stability that could create in Parliament something that outweighs the potential internal volatility that such a decision would create? And of course, one of the threats there would be a split in the ANC itself, right? Or even just a party where people are at war with each other while they're trying to govern with a new partner that they've never governed with. Similarly, the same applies in an MK or EFF or some kind of combination between the two coalition. There will be members, leaders, and indeed NEC members who fundamentally disagree with going back into a partnership with Julius Malema or Jacob Zuma and their parties. And the same logic applies, right? Because the threat there is that the media will be in hysterical mode, right? The markets will probably react negatively, the markets, right? And then you will have this internal ANC, and again, the possibility again of a split. Now, I don't see any of these splits actually being a split in half, right? Because historically, when we look at splits from the ANC, it tends to be a minority of the party that splits away. But how many more minority splits can the ANC tolerate, given that it's already at 40%, right? When it was Cope days, a minority split didn't hurt the ANC. But there have been so many minority splits that I don't know how much more the party can afford another minority split, right? So that would be one of the major threats that I see to the ANC is, what does the decision that they take do internally to the party? And you can bet your bottom rand, whatever it's valued at in the next week, that there will be internal division within the ANC no matter what they choose. And so managing that division is going to be key for ANC leaders and the ANC leaderships. What are the opportunities? I think that there's an opportunity here for President Cyril Ramaphosa, if he happens to be the president, or any other leader, to break free from the hold of ANC internal dynamics and put the country first, right? The ANC no longer determines what happens in the country, right? So I think the president of the country can turn around to the ANC and say, look, what matters now to save ourselves is that we actually deliver. We have to give people what they told us they didn't have. We have to get serious on corruption. We have to deliver services. We have to fix load shedding. Because if we don't do those things, we're going to go from 40 to 20. And I think to some extent, this electoral defeat incentivizes the ANC to govern because there's no other way out for the ANC. Now, they cannot lie to South Africans anymore, right? They have to deliver and they have to govern. And if they don't, they're going to be punished even further in 2026 and 2029, right? So I think there is an opportunity for ANC leaders to say, you know what? Never mind all this internal stuff. We have a crisis on our hands in this party. We're either going to die or we're going to govern. Which one is it going to be? And if we're going to govern, then you have to get behind me because I'm about to do some bold and ambitious things that deliver to our people. That would be the opportunity for me. And my goodness, wouldn't we all love to see an ANC do that? I must say, I already like this more humble ANC. Have you seen how humble ANC leaders have become? They're coming and they're looking mature. They're accepting defeat. They're saying, yes, no, we've heard the people. That's what we did in this election. We humbled the ANC. And maybe a more humble ANC is actually a better ANC. So that's the opportunity I foresee. Let's come on to the DA, because this is a fascinating one for me, right? Let's come on. I want to start with the opportunities for the DA. So I'm wearing the hat of a strategist of each of the different parties, right? If I'm a DA strategist, I'm looking very carefully at Gauteng. I'm saying, yeah, national government is nice and shiny, right? But here's our opportunity. We say to the ANC, we'll give you national majority or whatever, however that works out. What we want is Gauteng. And we don't just want Gauteng. We want the mayor of Joburg back. We want to retain the mayor of Tshwane. And we want Ekurhuleni back. And we want full control over that province. And we are going to transform that province. And voters and South Africans who see that transformation will then support us in 2026 and 2029 because we have delivered a major difference to the people of Gauteng, right? If I was the DA, that's what I would do, because if they can do that, not only would it be good for the country, because Gauteng needs good governance, better governance, but it would be good for the DA, right? Because they would be able to say, look at how we govern in the Western Cape, look at how we've turned Gauteng around. South Africans need to give us more power going forward. So I think that's what I would do. I think there's a big opportunity for the DA to regain full control, or for the first time to control Gauteng at both provincial and local level. Because remember, cities come into the mix in these conversations. And I would be saying, let's take Joburg, let's take Ekurhuleni, let's take Tshwane, and let's take Gauteng provincial government. Give the ANC what they want nationally, and let's govern Gauteng in a way that demonstrates that there is actually a difference that the DA constantly talks about. So that's what I would do if I was a DA strategist. So I think that is a big opportunity, not to get diverted by the bright lights of national government and to seize the provincial opportunity that is in front of the DA. If they have leverage, they could even maybe extend that to KZN, but I think that's a much more unstable situation. So I would wait for a better opening in KZN. So that's one big potential opportunity for the DA, I think. The threat to the DA, which I don't think that they're seeing, is that they must be very careful of pushing the ANC into policy positions that are actually deeply unpopular in South Africa. Because the DA must remember that its policy platform accounts for at most 20% of voters. The vast majority of voters in South Africa support economic redistribution, support a focus on pro-poor economic policies, support the idea of a minimum wage, support the idea of affirmative action and policies which recognize the journey that we're on towards racial justice, support the ANC's foreign policy positions, particularly in terms of questions like the ICJ case concerning the Israel, Palestine, and Gaza situation. Support the ethos of the liberation struggle and the idea of transformation. So if the DA is going to come in on some Thatcherite tip and say to hell with how unpopular these policies are, we are going to shove them down the throats of South Africans because we have leverage over the ANC. Believe me, they have another thing coming, because they are a 20% party at the end of the day. And they will see the true support for these policies if they think they can really take them away from the constituencies that believe in them. So I think the DA needs to be circumspect about how much they can extract from a policy perspective. What the DA needs to do if they go into local government is say, look, we're going to take these portfolios and we are going to execute on these portfolios, whatever those portfolios may be. If that's education, turn around education. If that's water, turn around water. If that's Department of Trade and Industry, turn around trade policy. If that's energy, make sure that not only does load shedding end, but that we have a surplus of energy and we turn this country into an energy oasis, right? So that's what I would do. I would not try to extract unpopular policy concessions from the ANC, because that will backfire on the DA and on the ANC big time. It will embolden the EFF and MK. Can you imagine trying to take away these popular policies and then what Julius Malema and Jacob Zuma will do with that? Okay, good luck if that's your strategy. Good luck is all I can say. So that would be a threat. Let's come to MK. I think the threat for MK is twofold. It's internal and it's external. Internally, the MK was really buoyed by being the new kid on the block in this election, and it papered over a lot of internal cracks in MK that we have seen. I see, just as I record this video, they have now removed their KZN premier candidate, the person who everyone thought would be KZN premier. We've seen these instability. We've seen this instability with Jabulani Khumalo, who got removed from the party when he seemed to be playing an important role in the party before. We've seen Nkosi Kanyile being disciplined. So there are clearly internal divisions in MK. And now that the election is over, they don't have this one goal of election performance to unite them. And so I think the big threat for MK, firstly, is can they hold together as a party going forward without an election to unite them? Of course, President Jacob Zuma plays a key role in uniting the party. But President Jacob Zuma is 82. President Jacob Zuma has reported to be in ill health for a long time now. So the MK party needs other forms of stability outside of just former President Zuma. So that's the big threat for MK is to what extent, and we just don't know this, can they be a coherent force after an election, or will they be devoured by their internal disputes? Because then what the ANC can do is say, just wait a little while. Let's let MK on the outside see what they can do, and let's see if they can stabilize. Maybe if they become stable after a while, then we can reconsider our position. But let's just see how long they can survive. So that's the one threat. The other threat, I think, is related to this position that they've taken on the election, which is, I think there are a lot of people who are just waiting to see what MK really is. Is it this party that people fear that is hell-bent on destruction and chaos and instability and resuscitating old forms of corruption networks? Or is it the party that is about getting serious about the lot of particularly Black South Africans, getting serious about questions of land, getting serious about questions of rural development and infrastructure, which the MK campaigned on? And now the MK must prove, I think, to other voters outside of its base that it's more of the latter than the former, right? And that requires just getting on with governing and getting on with changing things. And that will be a big test for the MK, right? Can they now take power in whatever place they choose and then actually use that power for the betterment of people? Or are they going to go down this road of calling into question the election and just creating a sense of anxiety and instability? I think that route is going to produce a backlash against MK, not just in DA voters and conservative people, but people who are on the fence about MK. Because remember, MK now has a chance to win even more votes going into 2026 and 2029, right? But they need to convince those people who are on the fence. If they alienate those people, then they will be stuck at 14, 15, or they may fall. If they're able to convince those people, then we could see an MK growing even more, governing key cities in KZN after this election, etc. So those are the threats and the opportunities I see for MK. I kind of included the opportunities in there. Let's talk about the EFF. Once again, I am not one who's writing the EFF off. So let's talk about the threats first. I think one threat to the EFF is that not only do they go backwards electorally, which they've already done, but they don't have an opportunity to govern anywhere. But this is a simultaneous threat and opportunity depending on what they do with it, right? So there's a world in which the ANC goes with the DA, or the ANC goes with MK, and the EFF is left out of either of those arrangements, right? And so it's still 10 years later just an opposition political party. And what that means is that the EFF still won't have the opportunity to really govern and demonstrate whether it can govern or not. Now, I know that it has been in some coalition arrangements in some cities, but quite frankly, that isn't really a representation one way or the other of whether the EFF is actually capable of governing. I think what the EFF would have wanted in this election is a chance to show that if you give us a ministry, or if you give us a province, or if you give us even a city, give it to us outright and let us demonstrate that we can govern. And then the test is the same test. Can they govern or can't they? If they can't, then they fall. If they can, then they rise, right? So I think that's one threat, is that the EFF is kind of left out of the situation, and they never get a chance to demonstrate that they can govern. Another threat, I think, is just MK itself. If MK continues to cohere and grow, then how many more EFF voters can they claim back, right? Can they eat into EFF support in Gauteng? Can they eat into more EFF support even in KZN? Can MK maybe grow its base outside of Mpumalanga, Gauteng, and KZN and start looking at Limpopo, start looking at Free State, start looking at Northwest? And in which case, the EFF will be in a battle over which is the party that represents a more radical tradition within the liberation movement tradition. And if MK wins that battle, EFF will be under pressure. There are threats in the mainstream media because the EFF's opponents there are chortling about the EFF's electoral decline. I think it's a little overblown. But if this narrative takes hold in mainstream media that the EFF is on the decline, is a finished party, which it definitely isn't, that won't be good for them. What are the opportunities? If I'm an EFF politician, I'm saying, and I'm putting my hat on now as an EFF strategist, as I have as a DA strategist and an ANC and an MK strategist in the previous sections. I'm saying an ANC-DA coalition is far from the worst thing that can happen. because we will be seen as the alternative to that coalition. In fact, it's a perfect opportunity because we can contrast ourselves against both the ANC and the DA. So that when the ANC-DA coalition inevitably makes some kind of policy compromise that is to the right rather than the left, the EFF can swoop in and prey on that strategic mistake, which will probably be unpopular in the electorate. And so I think if the EFF plays its cards right in opposition and says we're going to propose alternatives to the ANC-DA direction that are more pro-poor, more pro-black, then they will be able to attract a lot of people who are disaffected with the ANC-DA, especially if it fails to deliver on the already very high expectations. So as an EFF strategist, I'm not in a rush because I know that there are two options. Either ANC-DA go together, in which case we become the alternative to that and we frame ourselves around that alternative. Or we take the opportunity to govern. I would say it's not the time for outrageous demands. And I think we've already seen that. The EFF's not in a position to demand the resignation of Ramaphosa or demand the Ministry of Finance. It's just not in a strong enough position. But in the alternative, I say, look, these are the key ministries that we need to look at. Maybe there's one, maybe there's two nationally. We need to absolutely outperform in those ministries and make tangible changes that people recognize so that they start to think, the EFF is a party, yes, that can be loud in opposition, but it can also govern, right? I'm thinking to myself in the alternative, what can we do in Gauteng? And what concessions can we extract? Can we say to the ANC, sure, we'll help you with your national majority, but we want Joburg. We want to govern Joburg, and we want to turn Joburg around. Right? So I think there's an opportunity here for the EFF, if they're not in opposition, to really extract a key concession from the ANC. Because remember, viewers, listeners, parties can extract serious concessions from the ANC now, and they shouldn't be content with crumbs. They can extract more than ever before from the ANC, right? So the decision as to what a coalition partner, if they are a coalition partner, chooses to extract is going to be the key strategic choice. Do you choose to extract something, a big city? Do you choose to extract a province? Do you choose to extract a ministry? And which of those extractions will get you further down towards your political goals? So having said all of that, that's how I look at coalitions and the political perspectives of different political parties. And I hope I've been able to look at it from multiple perspectives as we go into this important few weeks in South African politics. I want to end by just looking at questions of policy, right? Because it feels like policy is getting lost in this debate as we look at politics with a capital P. But policy is really important in this election. And my question is, what kind of policy changes could we actually see? So when we look at an ANC-DA coalition, for example, it's clear to me that the DA would want to extract key policy concessions, but I'm not sure what those concessions would be. And I think this is the chat we need to have. Where would the DA extract a policy concession? And what concession? Is it going to be privatization of SOEs? And what kind of backlash would that generate? That might be an easier one, definitely, than affirmative action, like in my view. So the policy concessions that the DA extracts need to be concessions that obviously the DA believes in, weighed against what the potential public backlash against those policy concessions would be. I would not go anywhere near foreign policy because, believe me, the DA will be in a world of hurt and trouble if they try to change that direction. So, what exactly is it possible for the DA to get that they haven't got before, but that would not create a massive public backlash? It's an interesting question to ask, because suddenly you see that the window of the ANC-DA coalition is quite narrow in terms of which policy. And what we might just get is a continuation of existing policy rather than major shifts. Similarly, in an ANC, EFF, or MK national arrangement, it's quite clear that, politically speaking, expropriation without compensation is going to be a big lightning rod for criticism, right? And once again, the DA will make hay with that. The media will go into hysterical mode. International observers will start casting aspersions over South Africa, right? But is there, quite apart from whether you agree with, I've written a lot about my position on land and Section 25, so read what I've written and what my actual position is here. But I'm looking at the political dynamics. But is there a window for land reform? And what I mean by that is a real redistribution bill, which says this is how land will be redistributed. And I'm not just talking about state land, I'm talking about land that's privately held, and particularly commercial agricultural land, which we know is woefully unequally distributed right now. Is there a path there where we put the extreme or the perfect proposal aside on either side and say, what does that bill look like? How are we going to get land into the hands of people who have been dispossessed and make meaningful gains on land reform? That's what I would try to do in that coalition, is move the ball forward there meaningfully, but not necessarily try to extract my own policy, because one isn't in a position to do that, right? What other concessions maybe can be made on social grants and the social safety net? Is there a way that we can push forward more towards an idea of a universal basic income? And what do those modalities look like? So from a policy perspective, I think that's important. For the ANC and for the DA, they're going to have a really, really, really difficult problem on their hands if they, and for the EFF and for MK, whoever the coalition is, right? What happens with corruption? South Africans are tired of ANC corruption. If you go into partnership with the ANC, what is your stance on ANC corruption? Starting from the president down, right? From Phala Phala down. What happens there? Do you support the ANC, in which case you're now part of the problem? You're literally part of the problem of state capture by shielding people who may be involved in state capture allegations. So what do you do there? Or do you extract concessions on the ANC from a corruption perspective to say, one of our preconditions is that these ministers are not going to be in cabinet? And then does the ANC swallow and accept that? But again, if I'm an opposition party, I'm saying, and I know this might sound crazy because opposition parties want positions, I'm saying what they should do is say, we want to cut cabinet, actually. That would generate a lot of goodwill to say, in terms of our policy on where the government needs to go politically, this cabinet is bloated. Cut cabinet significantly. Give us some key positions within that newly cut cabinet, but take this opportunity not to have to divide the spoils across however 86 ministers and deputy ministers we have. So I think there's a deeper conversation, which we'll also move to on this channel, and I'd enjoy your thoughts below on what policy direction does South Africa need to take now? What should the national government do? And the one thing that I think all the parties obviously agree on is basic service delivery, right? But it's easy to say that. How do you get that done? Because the government that gets basics right will generate goodwill. So it seems that would be the foundation of any coalition platform. And then on top of that, you build certain policy directions and decisions that would be good for your party, but would not be extreme and unworkable and unattainable. So Fam, I hope you've enjoyed this big breakdown into where we are in South African politics. Like I say, like, share, comment, and subscribe. You don't have to agree with everything I say at all. Feel free to take a different position in the comments down below. But what's important is that as a country, we debate and we discuss these issues. Ultimately, we created this election outcome, and we will have to hold whatever government we get accountable. And I'm sure that we will discharge that constitutional responsibility as well as we have discharged our voting responsibilities. Like, share, subscribe. Help us get to the next milestone of subscribers. What shall we say that is? 150,000? And keep it locked on SMWX. If you're listening, give us a good rating on your podcast platform and give us a like, a share, and a subscribe on YouTube. We'll be back with more analysis as the week unfolds. Don't go anywhere. Aye.